Bill fidgeted with his graduation cap. The humid Missouri air stuck to him like glue. He had just graduated from the University of Missouri with a degree in history. He had no idea what he wanted to do with his life. He scanned the crowd for his parents. His dad gave him a thumbs up. Bill smiled back weakly. He was excited to be done with school, but he felt lost. After the ceremony, Bill's parents took him out to his favorite restaurant, Lambert's Cafe. They wanted to celebrate his accomplishment. He poked at his mashed potatoes. He was proud of himself for graduating. He just wished he had a little direction. As Bill ate his throwed rolls, his mum patted his hand. "It'll come to you, honey," she said. "You'll figure it out." Bill hoped she was right. Later that night, while lying in bed, Bill thought about his future. He had always been fascinated by history. He loved learning about the past. As a kid, he would spend hours in the library reading books about ancient civilizations and famous battles. He wanted to experience history, not just read about it, but he knew that was impossible. Or was it? Bill sat up in bed. An idea was forming in his mind. He remembered reading about a scientist in town who had made a discovery so incredible it seemed impossible. His name was Dr. Kegler. Dr. Kegler claimed to have invented a time machine. Bill had dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man, but now he wasn't so sure. Maybe, just maybe, Dr. Kegler was onto something. Maybe Bill's future wasn't so uncertain after all. Bill knew what he had to do. He had to meet this Dr. Kegler. The next morning, Bill set out to find Dr. Kegler. He found the scientist's address in an old newspaper article. He drove to the outskirts of town. He pulled up to a dilapidated house. The paint was peeling and the yard was overgrown. It looked abandoned. Bill hesitated. Maybe he had been wrong. Maybe Dr. Kegler was just a crazy old man. But he had come this far. He had to at least try. Bill knocked on the door. The sound echoed through the house. He waited, but no one answered. He tried the doorknob. To his surprise, it was unlocked. He cautiously stepped inside. The house was dark and dusty. It smelled like mothballs and old books. Bill coughed. "Hello," he called out. "Is anyone home?" A faint voice responded. "In here." Bill followed the voice to a small study. The room was cluttered with books, papers, and strange-looking gadgets. In the center of the room was a large metal sphere. It had wires and tubes sticking out of it every which way. It looked like something out of a science fiction movie. Slumped over a desk was Dr. Kegler. He was an old man with a shock of white hair and a long white beard. He looked frail and weak. Bill introduced himself. Dr. Kegler smiled. "I've been expecting you, Bill." Bill was taken aback. "You have? How?" Dr. Kegler chuckled. "Let's just say I'm a bit of a history buff myself." He coughed again, this one deeper and more ragged. "I don't have much time left, Bill," he said. "But what time I have left I must spend passing on my knowledge, my life's work." Dr. Kegler gestured to the large metal sphere. "This, Bill, is the time item retrieval machine. It's a time machine." Bill stared at the machine in awe. He couldn't believe it was real. "But how?" he stammered. Dr. Kegler smiled. "It's a long story, one I'm afraid I don't have time to tell, but I've been watching you, Bill. You're a bright young man, a historian. You're the only one I can trust with this." Dr. Kegler handed Bill a small, leather-bound notebook. "This notebook contains all my research. Everything you need to know about the machine. Promise me you'll use it wisely, Bill. Promise me you'll use it for good." Dr. Kegler died that night. Bill was devastated. He had only known the old man for a few hours, but in that short time, Dr. Kegler had become like a mentor to him. He had entrusted Bill with his greatest invention, and Bill was determined to honor his promise. He would use the time item retrieval machine for good. Bill spent the next few weeks studying Dr. Kegler's notebook. It was filled with complex equations and diagrams. At first, Bill could make neither heads nor tails of it, but slowly he began to understand the principles behind Dr. Kegler's work. He learned about the space-time continuum, temporal mechanics, and the butterfly effect. He learned about the dangers of time travel. The more Bill learned, the more he realized how much he didn't know. He also realized how dangerous the machine could be in the wrong hands. He decided to move the time item retrieval machine to his parents' basement. He told them it was an antique he had inherited. They didn't ask too many questions. Bill spent countless hours in the basement, studying the machine, making sure he understood how it worked. He knew that even the smallest mistake could have disastrous consequences. He ran simulation after simulation, testing every possible scenario. He wanted to be ready for anything. He wasn't sure what he wanted to accomplish with the machine, but he knew he had to be careful. One evening, Bill was running a simulation. He had been working non-stop for days. He was exhausted, but he couldn't stop. He was so close to perfecting the machine's targeting system, he just had to make a few more adjustments. Bill stared at the machine's control panel. There were so many buttons, knobs, and levers. It was overwhelming. But Bill was determined to figure it out. He reached for a dial, ready to fine-tune the temporal coordinates, but his hand slipped. His elbow bumped a large red button on the control panel, the button labeled Initiate. The machine shuddered to life. The room was bathed in a blinding white light. Bill shielded his eyes. He could hear a high-pitched whine coming from the machine. It was getting louder and louder. Bill realized what was happening. The machine was activating. He tried to hit the off switch, but it was too late. The machine let out an ear-splitting roar. The basement shook violently. Bill was thrown to the ground. Then, everything went quiet. Bill slowly got to his feet. He was covered in dust and debris. He looked around the basement. It was completely trashed. Tools and equipment were scattered everywhere. The time item retrieval machine was still humming, but something was different. There was a faint shimmer in the air in front of it. Bill cautiously approached the machine. As he got closer, the shimmer became more pronounced. He could make out the shapes of people, but these weren't ordinary people. Bill's jaw dropped in astonishment. Standing before him was a group of Mongol warriors dressed in full battle armor. They looked confused and disoriented. They were shouting at each other in a language Bill didn't understand. Before Bill could react, the warriors surged forward. They shoved past him, knocking him to the ground. Bill scrambled to his feet and ran out of the basement. Bill burst into the living room, his heart pounding. He could hear the Mongol warriors right behind him. They were shouting and waving their swords. His parents were sitting on the couch watching TV. They looked up in surprise. "Bill, what's all the commotion?" his mother asked. Before Bill could answer, the Mongol warriors stormed into the living room. His father jumped to his feet, grabbing the TV remote like a weapon. "What in the—" he started. Bill's mother screamed. The Mongol warriors fanned out across the living room. They were speaking rapidly in their native tongue, their voices filled with confusion and fear. One of the warriors, who appeared to be the leader, approached Bill's father. He pointed his sword at the TV, which was showing a commercial for denture adhesive. The warrior shouted something in Mongolian. Bill's father glanced at the TV, then back at the warrior. He shrugged, utterly bewildered. Bill, still catching his breath, tried to explain to his parents that these were not actors in costume. They're real, Mum, Dad. They're Mongolian warriors from the 13th century. His parents stared at him, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. His mother fainted, dead away on the couch. While Bill tried to revive his mother, the Mongol warriors continued to explore the living room. They were fascinated by everything they saw. One warrior was examining a lamp, his fingers tracing the outline of the shade. Another warrior had discovered the coffee table book of Impressionist paintings. He was flipping through the pages, his eyes wide with wonder. The lead warrior, still brandishing his sword, was growing increasingly agitated. He barked an order to his men. They immediately snapped to attention, their hands hovering over their weapons. Bill, fearing the worst, stepped forward. "Please," he pleaded, "they don't mean any harm. They're just lost and confused." The lead warrior fixed his gaze on Bill. After a tense moment, he lowered his sword slightly. He spoke a single word. "Food?" Bill's father, who had recovered from his initial shock, stepped forward. "I'll order pizza," he declared, and so the most surreal dinner party in history commenced. Bill, his father, and a group of 13th century Mongol warriors sat around the dining room table sharing a pepperoni pizza and discussing the merits of horseback riding versus the internal combustion engine. The pizza arrived, and Bill's father managed to communicate through a series of gestures that they should put away their swords before eating. The warriors, famished from their unexpected journey through time, readily agreed. They devoured the pizza with gusto, wiping their mouths with the backs of their hands. Bill's father, ever the hospitable host, kept the pizzas coming. He even managed to dig a six-pack of beers out of the back of the fridge. The Mongol warriors were quite taken with this effervescent beverage of the gods, as one of them described it. Just as things were settling into a bizarre kind of normalcy, the doorbell rang again. Bill's heart sank. He had a bad feeling about this. He cautiously opened the door. Standing on the porch was a man who looked like he had stepped straight out of the 19th century. He was wearing a white suit and a straw hat. He had a thick moustache and a mischievous twinkle in his eye. "Well, hello there, son," the man drawled. "Mark Twain's the name, and I do believe I've stumbled into quite the shindig." Before Bill could even process what was happening, a high-pitched shriek echoed from the basement stairs. A group of Roman centurions, armed with gladius swords and shields, marched into the living room. They had clearly missed the pizza party. They began shouting in Latin, demanding to know where they were and what year it was. Bill's living room was now a chaotic scene, straight out of a historical fiction fever dream. He had a group of Mongol warriors arguing with a Roman centurion about the merits of Genghis Khan versus Julius Caesar. Mark Twain was regaling Bill's father with tall tales, punctuated by hearty laughter and slugs of beer. Bill's mother remained mercifully unconscious on the couch. And that was when the doorbell rang again. Bill stared at the time item retrieval machine, his brow furrowed in concentration. He had managed to herd everyone, the Mongols, the Romans, Mark Twain, and a very confused-looking Winston Churchill, who had arrived just before dessert into the basement. His parents were upstairs trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy amidst the chaos. Bill had assured them he would fix this. He had to fix this. He scanned Dr. Keegler's notebook, frantically searching for the section on returning unintended temporal guests. The problem was, Dr. Keegler had never considered the possibility of multiple unintended guests from different time periods all showing up at once. The machine hummed and sputtered, seemingly as overwhelmed by the situation as Bill was. He realized he was going to have to improvise. Bill began inputting coordinates manually, hoping to at least send back the Mongols before the situation escalated further. He wasn't sure what kind of diplomatic incident a group of 13th century warriors would cause in 21st century Missouri, but he doubted it would be good. He managed to lock onto a location and time period in Mongolia, praying he wasn't accidentally sending them into the middle of a battle, or worse, a volcano. With a deep breath and a silent apology to the space-time continuum, he hit the return button. The Mongols vanished in a flash of light, leaving behind only the faint scent of horses and fermented mare's milk. Bill allowed himself a small sigh of relief. One group down, several more to go. He turned his attention to the Roman centurions, who were now engaged in a spirited game of charades with Mark Twain, much to Winston Churchill's amusement. The hours that followed were a blur of frantic calculations, near disasters, and more than a few lucky breaks. Bill managed to send the Roman centurions back to their own time, albeit a few decades off target. He convinced Winston Churchill he was simply experiencing a particularly vivid dream induced by a bad batch of brandy. And Mark Twain seemed perfectly content to stay right where he was, observing the absurdity of the 21st century with a mixture of amusement and quiet horror. By dawn, Bill had managed to send everyone back to their respective time periods. Mark Twain, after much cajoling and the promise of a future interview for his memoirs, finally agreed to return to the 19th century. He even left Bill with an autographed copy of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, inscribed with the words, "To Bill, a man who knows a thing or two about unexpected journeys." The basement was trashed, but at least it was empty. Except for Bill and the time item retrieval machine, which hummed contentedly as if nothing out of the ordinary had transpired. Bill collapsed onto an overturned milk crate, utterly exhausted. He had aged a decade in a single night. Upstairs, his parents were making breakfast, their faces etched with a mixture of fatigue and bewilderment. Bill had tried to explain what had happened, but they didn't quite believe him, or maybe they just didn't want to. He couldn't blame them. Even he was having trouble processing the events of the past night. As he ate his burnt toast and drank his lukewarm coffee, Bill thought about Dr. Keegler. He wondered what the old scientist would have made of all this. He imagined Dr. Keegler smiling down at him, a twinkle in his eye. "I told you it was a powerful machine, Bill," he could almost hear him saying. "Use it wisely." Bill knew he had been given a second chance. He had made a mistake, a near catastrophic one, but he had learned from it. He had a newfound respect for the power and the peril of the time item retrieval machine. He realized that Dr. Keegler's invention wasn't just a machine. It was a responsibility, a burden, a gift. He spent the next few weeks repairing the time item retrieval machine, reinforcing the safety protocols and triple-checking every calculation. He wasn't sure what the future held. He didn't know if he would ever feel ready to activate the machine again, but he knew he couldn't just abandon it. He had to honor Dr. Keegler's legacy. He thought about all the possibilities, all the mysteries of history he could unlock. He could witness firsthand the building of the pyramids, the signing of the Magna Carta, the first moon landing. He could meet his heroes, right wrongs, maybe even change the course of history. But he also remembered the chaos, the confusion, the sheer terror in the eyes of those he had accidentally plucked from their own time. He realized that time travel wasn't a game, it wasn't a toy, it was a force of nature, and like all forces of nature, it had to be treated with respect and caution. Bill took a deep breath and closed Dr. Keegler's notebook. He had a lot to think about, a lot to learn. The future of the past, it seemed, was now in his hands. He just hoped he was up to the task.